Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 15-minute devotional. We appreciate you logging in each Sunday night and being a part of these brief lessons. And we always hope that something that's said each Sunday night will be beneficial to you and practical and helpful and will help you in your Christian walk as you go about your week. If you've heard me preach many times over the past years, you know that I have an affinity for poetry, especially poetry written by a man by the name of Robert Frost. Robert Frost wrote a poem that I've quoted many times in the pulpit, and you've probably read yourself, that talked about a man standing at the head of two paths, trying to make a choice which one to take, and he ended up taking the one less traveled. And that poem says, "And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no foot had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." Now, as great as that poem is, I believe that's been made better. Dr. Seuss got a hold of a road less traveled and reworked it so it sounds like this. A Zode in the Road by Dr. Seuss. Did I ever tell you about the young Zode who came to two sides at a fork in the road? He looked one way and then the other too. So the Zode had to make up his mind what to do. Well, the Zode scratched his head, his chin, and his pants, and he said to himself, "Now I'll be taking a chance. If I go place one, that place may be hot. So how will I know if I like it or not? On the other hand, though, I'll feel such a fool if I go to place two and find it's too cool. In that case, I may catch a chill and turn blue. So place one may be best, and not place two. On the other hand, though, if place one is too high, I might catch a terrible earache and die. On the other hand, though, if place two is too low, I might get some terrible pain in my toe. So place one may be the best," and he started to go. And he stopped and said, "On the other hand, though, on the other hand, though." And for 36 hours and one half that Zode made starts and stops at the fork in the road, saying, "No, don't take a chance, you may not be right." Then he got an idea that was wonderfully bright. "I'll simply start off to both places at once." And that's how the Zode who would not take a chance got no place at all, with a split in his pants. Now you're probably wondering what that great piece of literature has to do with the church here at Aniana or you as a Christian. And there's some of you that have already heard enough sermons that you have already made up the point in your mind. Every one of us is fearfully and wonderfully made by the Creator of the universe. And in the heart of each one of us, we were given dignity and the danger of decision. Sometimes we make wise decisions and enjoy the benefits. Sometimes we make unwise decisions and have to reap the consequences. And it's that fear that keeps us from reaching out and doing the wonderful things that God has called us as a church to do. When you ask the question, why do we have 120 people in an auditorium that'll seat over 300? Is it because we're afraid that if we make the decision to be evangelistic, we might mess up our family atmosphere? Why have you not asked someone to come to worship with you and be with you during one of the most important times during the week? Is it because you're afraid you might offend them and run them off? Why haven't you told someone about the hope that lives in your heart? Because you're afraid that if you do, then they will ask you a question that you can't answer. And so just like the Zode from Dr. Seuss, we're caught between what we know we need to do and what we want to do. And some of us, maybe for the last 40 years, have done nothing but get a rip in our pants. Our amazing Creator sits in heaven and listens to the cries of distress coming from this community, and He wants to send them an answer. For every cry of God's people, God has an answer. And His answer is almost always God's people. What I'm saying to you tonight is this, is that you are the answer. If you'd look at the Old Testament, there's a man by the name of Moses, and Moses was God's answer. Look with me at the 3rd chapter of the book of Exodus. Let's read verses 7 through 10. And it says, "And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry, and by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land of Egypt into a land good and large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come up to me, and I also have seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians are oppressing them. Come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Here we have an example of when God told Moses, you are the answer. You remember the story of Israel's 400-year enslavement in Egypt. The cruel boot of oppression that was leaning on Israel's throat nearly crushed the life out of God's people. They worked when the government told them to work. They worked where the government told them to work. They worked how they were told with the materials the government gave them. For the last generation, every male boy had been slaughtered by the government. And now they were crying out to God. And God says, I have seen, I have heard, and I am concerned. I'm coming down to help you. Moses, come here. You're my answer. But Moses didn't want to be God's answer, so he argued with God. Can't you just hear it? Well, who do I say told me to go? And God said, you tell them I sent you. But God, I'm not a great talker. As a matter of fact, I'm a horrible talker. I have a lisp and a weird accent. And God said to Moses, if I say I can use you, I can use you. I think a lot of us are like Moses. There are folks in our lives, in our communities, crying out for help, needing peace and comfort that can only be given by a loving God, and we freeze. We look at our own imperfections and we think that God can't use us. We know our failures and we think that we'll mess things up worse if we even try, so we just sit idly by. And the problem with that mentality is that God didn't buy it from Moses, and he surely will not buy it from us. God knew that his people needed an answer, and Moses was to be that answer. So against his original desires, Moses decided to become God's answer. And with that decision, he became one of the greatest figures in all of history. He led Israel out of Egyptian slavery, through the wilderness, right up to the promised land. And then Moses was gone. And the people said, Lord, don't leave us here. You promised you'd give us this land. Lord, don't let us die in the wilderness. And God said, I've seen, I've heard, I'm concerned, and I'm coming down to help you. So he finds Joshua, God's answer. You remember Joshua's call in Joshua 1? Start reading verse 6. It says, be strong and of good courage, for unto this people shalt thou divide an inheritance of the land, which I swear unto their fathers to give them. Only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou may observe to do all according to the law which Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper wheresoever thou goest. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, and thou mayest observe to do all the things which is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and thou shalt have good success. Have I not commanded thee? Be strong and of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. We're kind of left with the impression that Joshua wasn't very strong or courageous when you read those words. But instead, I get the feeling that he had seen the great work done by Moses and was living in fear that he would never be able to measure up to that type of success. Sometimes we fail to move into action not because of physical problem like Moses, but because of a better than Joshua type problem. I know that following in the footsteps of a great man or woman can be intimidating. As Joshua looked at the task in front of him, I'm sure that it was daunting. But remember that Joshua was one of the 2 spies that returned to say they could take this promised land. For 40 years, he and Caleb walked with Moses while every adult died in the wilderness. So Joshua knew firsthand the power and protection of God, but yet he was still afraid. But what if he wasn't as good a leader as Moses was? What if his decisions took the presence of God away from the Israelites? What if he leads them right back into slavery? If the people rebelled against a great leader like Moses, how can I keep them from rebelling against me? But with all of those questions and all of those fear about his ability to do what God needed him to do, he stepped up and did it. He allowed God to use him to be the answer. He led them into all the battles of Jericho and all the others. He took the promised land, but they never quite became the people of a promised life. You see, it may take courage to fight and win freedom, but it takes character to keep it. For all freedom does is give us the power to make choices. If we use our freedom to make the wrong choices, we lose our freedom. It's true of nations and individuals. History's garbage dump is heaped with the lives and nations of people who use their freedom to make the wrong choices. And next and finally tonight, let's look at Gideon. God's answer that we read about in the Judges. We read about in chapter 6. I'm not going to read the entire chapter, but the Midianites, who were driven out by the Israelites, eventually came back and drove God's people into the hills and caves. They destroyed their homes and crops, took their livestock. Judges chapter 6 verse 6 says, the people were so impoverished by the Midianites that they called out to God, and God said, I have seen, I have heard, I'm concerned. I'm coming down to help you. Gideon, come here. You're my answer. And apparently Gideon didn't know the story of Moses all too well. He answers God's request in much the same way that Moses did. He said, God, I'm from the least important tribe of all of Judah. I'm the least important family in the least important tribe. I'm the least important person in the least important family of the least important tribe. Surely you don't think I'm the answer. Gideon's fear to serve God was because he just wasn't good enough to do God's work. He was the least of the last in his mind. But in God's mind, that was just the type of person that the kingdom needed. God's reply to Gideon probably went something like this. You dare to ask me how I can use you when I'm the one who called you? We have to remember that when God calls us to work in his kingdom, then he will qualify us to do that job. When God calls you to do something, you can do anything. And God has called us to be the salt and light in this community, and he's not concerned with our supposed limitation. God can work through us to change our community if we're willing to let him. This is the way that God works throughout all of Scripture. God's people cry out to him, and he says, I have seen, I have heard, I'm concerned, and I'm coming down to help you. And God calls someone, some anonymous nobody, someone nobody but God would have considered, and God says, come here, you're my answer. When Jesus came out of the tomb and met with the disciples, they must have thought it was the most exciting thing that had ever happened. Here they were, poor, uneducated, unlettered, powerless. They were living in a world full of people crying out to God, and Jesus said to them, I've seen, I've heard, I'm concerned, and I'm coming down to rescue. Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, Simon, Judas, son of James, come here. You're my answer. And he sent them out to convert the world. Today, I want to ask you to do two things, just two. First, I want you to remember the people who were God's answer for you. There was a time in all of our lives when all we knew how to do was cry and make dirty diapers. And God's answer for you was a mom and dad who fed you, bathed you, kissed your scraped knees, and comforted you at night when you were afraid of the thunder. They disciplined you, and they encouraged you when you were brokenhearted. They defended you when you were attacked. They confronted you when you were wrong. They loved you in a million different ways. They were your parents. But there have been others in your lives that have been God's answer, have there not? For me, one of God's answers was a man named Kenny Jackson, a friend who didn't judge, just loved and listened until 3 o'clock in the morning on one particular night when I was suffering. He kept me grounded and told me the right thing to do 23 years ago. God used him, and he's used him many times since to be the answer. And here's the second thing I want you to do. I want you to listen. I want you to listen for two sounds. The first will be a sorrowful and lonely sound, or it might be an angry and belligerent sound, or it might be broken and weak, or loud and defiant. It'll be the sound of people crying out to God. People in our community and in our lives cry out to God in different ways. Some of them don't even know they need God. They just know they need something, and so they cry out. So listen for their cries. Then I want you to listen for another sound. It won't be the sound, it won't be the kind of sound you hear, but it will be you'll feel it. It'll be a voice coming from within you. And it will be strangely familiar to you, like you've heard it before in a Sunday school class or a worship service or maybe at a fireside devotional. It'll say, come here. I've seen, I've heard, I'm concerned, and I'm coming down to help. And you are my answer for these people who are crying out. Thank you so much for listening to the devotion tonight. We hope that you have an outstanding week. Please come be with us this Wednesday night for Bible study at 7 p.m. And if you can't, log into the live stream. And if you can't be there for either of those, we'll see you next Sunday morning for Bible class and then for worship. Thank you for being here and have a great week.